Session number 6, as I roll up my sleeves and get ready here, is what really happened at the Council of Nicea. This is going to be pretty straightforward, just essentially exactly as I have it up here. I do need to credit someone, and I will when I get to the particular point, for a lot of this material. I'm not a historian by training, and this is going to be largely historical. I'm basically a text person, although I have one degree in ancient history, but it's not my real focus. But I think I'll be able to communicate some good material from a friend of mine who was gracious enough to allow me to use it. The focus here again are some statements to begin in the Da Vinci Code about the Council of Nicea. Again, drawing from the dialogue, Teebing says, Jesus' establishment as the Son of God was officially proposed and voted on by the Council of Nicea. Sophie says, hold on, you're saying Jesus' divinity was the result of a vote? A relatively close vote at that, Teebing added. Well, we'll see. Other assertions about Nicea in the Da Vinci Code. One was, you'll get a very strong feeling that the council was controlled by Constantine. Very hard to read the book and not come away with that impression. Second, that Constantine never truly converted to Christianity, but was a lifelong pagan. That is something that the book makes a point of. Third, that the council, under orders from Constantine, dictated which books got into the New Testament. This is more heavily put forth by Brown's sources, but it is suggested in the book, so I'll include it. Fourth, the idea of Jesus' deity was invented by Constantine in relation to the outcome of this council. 5, Jesus' deity was decided upon by a close vote. So these are the points of contention. And again, I do want to credit Dr. Ronald Heine, who was at Puget Sound Christian College here in the local area, because a lot of this stuff is adapted from his presentation on this topic. He is an early church scholar. But let's just jump in here, since we've credited him. Constantine and the Christian faith. Constantine's conversion does get associated with an incident that happened at the Milvian Bridge in a battle near Rome against Maxentius, the emperor of the Western Roman Empire. Again, if you remember your world civ, the Roman Empire was divided into two portions. There was an east and a west. And at certain points, they were both ruled over by emperors. There wasn't just one. Constantine had prayed for divine help against Maxentius and had seen some kind of vision in the sky. Again, we've probably heard this story, which he or his advisors interpreted as coming from the Christian God. We don't really know what it was, for sure. Constantine's victory at the Milvian Bridge appears to have influenced him toward a policy of favoring Christianity. Now, this much is pretty well agreed on by all parties. The real issue is what happens with Constantine afterwards. Does this have any lasting effect? Well, the Da Vinci Code would say no. He didn't convert. He just went back to being a pagan and decided to use Christianity for political gain. And that's what we're here to question. Prior to Constantine's victory, Christianity had been an illegal religion. Christians were deprived of property rights, legal rights of assembly. They didn't have appeal in legal proceedings. And Constantine had been a worshiper of the sun god. This much is clear. The short-term results of Constantine's victory are that he did, in fact, maintain allegiance to the sun god. There's no evidence immediately that he had this really long-lasting conversion or even a dramatic conversion at all. However, despite the fact that he does continue this allegiance, and there's evidence from the coins to credit the sun god, he quickly began to grant privileges to Christians. He began to change Roman policy. Specifically, in February of 313, he met Licinius, the emperor of the eastern section of the Roman Empire in Milan, and they together issued what has become known, if you remember your history of civ again, as the Edict of Milan. He also began giving large gifts to the church and favoring Christian clergy. So there is some sort of change, some sort of impact, not what you'd really call a long-lasting or profound conversion, because he's also maintaining loyalty to the sun god. The Edict of Milan in 313 was not just aimed exclusively at Christians. It was an edict of toleration for all religions. Our purpose, the two of them, Constantine and Licinius, say at the beginning of the edict, and of course we have the edict, our purpose is to grant both the Christians and to all others full authority to follow whatever worship each person has desired. So it's an edict of toleration, just generally. Christians specifically are given legal rights in the edict, and it orders that all property that had been confiscated from Christians should be immediately returned without demand of payment. What about Constantine and Sunday? This is another claim in the Da Vinci Code. And again, it's something that we're talking about it here because we're trying to follow a loosely chronological flow as Constantine's life touches on things that the Da Vinci Code claims. In 321, Constantine ordered that Sunday, the day on which Christians worshiped, would be kept free of legal proceedings. It used to be before he did this that Christians could be dragged into these legal proceedings on their day of worship, and if they objected, it's like, who cares? You're just a Christian. Constantine passed legislation that prevented that from happening. The Da Vinci Code, though, is incorrect when it says that Constantine named the Christian day of worship Sunday in honor of the sun god, and also when it suggests that he changed the day on which Christians worship from Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath, to Sunday. These are both claims made in the book. How do we know that's wrong? Well, the early church fathers who were living and writing before Constantine was ever born said this: on the day called Sunday, there's the Sunday, all who live in cities and in the country gather together to one place. This is Justin Martyr speaking again about Christians in his Apologia. Justin also says very clearly that Christians did not observe the Sabbath. They worshipped on Sunday. In the letter of Barnabas, again mid-2nd century, the first day of the week on which Christians worshipped is referred to as the 8th day to contrast it with the Sabbath. Again, these are all primary texts that basically show us that the Da Vinci Code's revelation is incorrect. Now, what about his real conversion? Or this is what I'm sort of terming his real conversion. Until 323, Constantine apparently maintained some sort of allegiance to the sun god. But there is evidence that at that time he began turning more completely to Christian God, to Jesus, and so on and so forth. In 323, Constantine faced Licinius, emperor of the eastern section of the empire. Again, he was a worshiper of the traditional Roman gods, so now they're fighting. Before they had been issuing a nice edict, and now they're enemies. The decisive battle between them took place on September 18, 324, just 8 months before Nicea. Constantine won the battle, became sole emperor, and there is evidence that this victory really prompted him to follow the Christian God. Now, this is from Eusebius's Life of Constantine. Eusebius was an ancient writer who recorded some of these events in early church history. The chapter there in Roman numerals, I believe, I hate Roman numerals, 55, I think. Quotation is long, but it's significant. And now I beseech thee, this is Constantine speaking. This is what's being recorded. I beseech thee, most mighty God, to be merciful and gracious to thine eastern nations, to thy people in these provinces, worn as they are by protracted miseries, and grant them healing through thy servant. Not without cause, O holy God, do I prefer this prayer to thee, the Lord of all. Under thy guidance I have devised and accomplished measures fraught with blessings. Preceded by thy sacred sign, he's alluding back to this thing he saw at the Milvian Bridge. I have led thy armies to victory, and still on each occasion of public danger I follow the same symbol of thy perfections while advancing to meet the foe. Therefore, I have dedicated to thy service a sole duty, tempered by love and fear, for thy name I truly love. While I regard with reverence the power of which thou hast given abundant proofs to the confirmation and increase of my faith, I hasten then to devote all my powers to the restoration of thy most holy dwelling place, which those profane and impious men have defiled by the contamination of violence. He continues in the next chapter, my own desire is for the common good of the world and the advantage of all mankind, that thy people should enjoy a life of peace and undisturbed concord. He goes on with this, and about little under midway down, he says, only let men of sound judgment be assured of this, that those only can live a life of holiness and purity whom thou callest to a reliance upon thy holy laws. With regard to those who will hold themselves aloof from us, now catch that, he is grouping himself in one category, and he's going to distinguish himself from someone else. Those who withhold themselves aloof from us, let them have, if they please, their temples of lies. He is distinguishing himself here from pagans. He calls their temples of lies. He is switching allegiances. Next chapter, truly our worship is no new or recent thing, but one which thou hast ordained for thine own due honor. From the time when, as we believe, this system of the universe was first established, and although mankind have deeply fallen and have been seduced by manifold errors, yet, catch the quote, yet hast thou revealed a pure light in the person of thy Son. He is clearly not aligning himself with pagans at this point. They worship in the temple of lies. They don't do what we do, us, them. This is much stronger than it had been up to this point. What about Constantine's deathbed baptism? The Da Vinci Code asserts that Constantine was not baptized until he was near death and too frail to prevent it from being done. Teabing says that. According to Eusebius's Life of Constantine, there you have the reference, Constantine postponed baptism until he was near death. That is true. But there's no evidence that it was done against his will. In other words, he's not like fighting against it. That has to be inserted into the account. Delaying baptism was actually not an uncommon thing in the early church. The fathers didn't like it, but it was actually pretty common. As late as the 5th century, baptism was often postponed to avoid the responsibilities it incurred, basically spiritual laziness. Public proclamation, if I do this, then certain things are going to be expected of me, and I don't know if I really want to go through with that. And Constantine was apparently one of those. In the late 4th century, Gregory of Nyssa preached a sermon called Against Those Who Put Off Baptism. So this was a big enough problem that Gregory devotes a whole written sermon to it that, of course, gets circulated. Council of Nicea. The Da Vinci Code asserts that the idea that Jesus was God cannot be found prior to Nicea. We've dealt with that in session 5. Primary source material from the early fathers also illustrates the error of the Da Vinci Code and Brown's sources and sets the stage for what Nicea was really about. It was well known by the 2nd century AD that Christians considered Jesus to be divine far more than a man. We get this from pagans. There is pagan testimony to the fact that Christians worship Jesus as God well before the time of Constantine. This is from Pliny the Younger to the Emperor Trajan, 1st decade of the 2nd century AD. Pliny writes, again in his letter, meanwhile, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, I have observed the following procedure. I interrogated these as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second time and a third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed. For I had no doubt that whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy surely deserved to be punished. There were others possessed of the same folly, so on and so forth. Because they were Romans, I couldn't kill them. Remember Paul, this actually saves Paul's life in the book of Acts, the fact that he's a Roman citizen. It's alluded to right here. They asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God. Okay? This is a pagan source, Pliny. We get it from early Christians as well. I'm only going to give you 2 examples here. In a sermon, 3 examples actually. A sermon or a homily called Second Clement, chapter 1, verse 1, which dates from the middle of the 2nd century, begins this way. Brethren, we must think of Jesus Christ as of God. Ignatius refers in one of his letters to Jesus Christ, our God, specifically his letter to the Ephesians. And he says in another place, I glorify Jesus Christ, the God who has given you wisdom. It's his letter to Smyrna. This is 150, 125, 150 years before Constantine. We've already seen textually, when it comes to the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, this is what the Scriptures taught. This is the position that manifested itself very early as orthodoxy, but it wasn't the only way that people looked at it because it's a tough issue. Now, I'm going to refer you to the writings of Larry Hurtado. I know Larry. Larry and I have corresponded a bit. He teaches at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. He's an American. Very nice guy. His tradition is the Assemblies of God, but he's not that anymore. He would still call himself a Christian, though. He wouldn't like conservative labels that the Americans use. Hurtado has done a truckload of work in this area. Specifically, he has devoted his scholarly expertise to two areas. One is papyrus study. The other is to the early worship of Jesus. If you want a book that is cluttered, chock full of primary source references for the early worship of Jesus as God, this is where you go. Larry is also one of the scholars I know who's read my dissertation. We go back and forth on that. I've gotten him to change his mind over a couple things, but I'm still working on one or two more. I don't know if you'll ever see this, but give him a little ribbing there. But he's a wonderful guy, just does great work. And if you want primary source material, he's the guy. That's where you should go. The struggle that led to Nicea, how to articulate Jesus as a divine being, this is the problem. You know, we see the text, we see these passages. I took you through a number of them before, and it's like, well, how do we put this into words? How do we express, you know, a father and a son who are both Yahweh? And how do we be monotheists while we're doing that? And what about when one prays to the other? And the whole thing about becoming a man. I mean, this is mind-bending stuff. The texts themselves, if you really look at them closely, now that you've been exposed to them, there are a number of texts that are fairly clear that there's some two-ness going on here. But the problem was how to articulate that. What does that mean? Yeah, that was tough. So what did the Scriptures teach in this regard? The first view, and this is the view that was the dominant view, it's the view that has become recognized as orthodoxy, it's the view that was recognized as the majority Orthodox opinion before Nicea, and the one that will win the day at the end of the council. This view was that Jesus and God the Father were the same in essence. Both had therefore always existed. That's a key element. However, they were distinct persons. View number one. I'm not going to read the whole thing here, but there was discussion both in Jewish writings, Philo, his discussion of Logos, and New Testament passages, that the Logos was, again, the second deity entity. And the question was, chronologically, where does the Logos come from? Did the Logos have a beginning? Or was the Logos always with God and God just brought the Logos forth? This view said he was always there and God brought him forth. Other views said he came into existence at some point. View number two said Jesus was God the Father. Now catch the distinction. First view says Jesus and God the Father are the same in essence, but they're distinct persons. The second approach was just to say, well, Jesus is just the Father. He is the Father. The Son is the Father. Now the problem with that became known as modalistic monarchianism, was that it raised some difficult points. Middle paragraph. The view solved the problem of worshiping God and Jesus. Hey, they're the same guy. No problem there. You were worshiping only one God because Jesus was God the Father. However, it created other problems. If Jesus were God the Father, then God the Father suffered and died on the cross. I mean, how can you have that happen if it's the same being? Totally. How can he lay dead in a grave for 3 days? How could that be? To whom did Jesus pray? I mean, is Jesus praying to himself then? So it just created problems, and it was not accepted, but it was around prior to Nicea. View number 3 said Jesus was not God. He was also not man. He was something in between. Jesus was a human being like all other human beings, except that he had been born of a virgin. Because Jesus was a very religious man, he was chosen by God, and a special power called Christ descended on him. 2 variations. One would lean to saying, well, he was just a man, but then he was like indwelled by this Christ thing. The other one would say, and this gets closer to Gnosticism, that the heavenly Jesus manifested himself as an earthly Jesus. So kind of a man, but not, just this trying to wrap their minds around this position. But he definitely wasn't God in the same essence. He definitely wasn't the Father. He definitely wasn't the same essence. He was something different. Again, this is close to Gnosticism. The view was actually called Docetism, though. Docetism taught that Jesus did not have a real human body. It only looked like he was human. He only appeared as a human. He wasn't really incarnated. Again, this view was more of a denial of the humanity of Christ, and it gets close to the Gnostic view. Now, along came an important figure, Arius of Alexander, who became a focal point in the struggle to articulate all this. How to assert that Jesus was God and worship him and still claim monotheism. Arius was a presbyter in Alexandria, Egypt, under the jurisdiction of Alexander, Bishop of Alexandria. Sometime before 318, Alexander began to dispute what Arius was teaching about Christ, and he called a synod to discuss the matter, and the synod condemned Arius. Now that synod was not Nicea, something that happened earlier, because Alexander was a little concerned about his understudy here. Arius' writings have not been preserved, but a few things have been preserved in the writings of the church fathers who wrote against him. Athanasius quotes a creed that Arius and his followers sent to the bishop Alexander. And an excerpt here, this is Arius' position. We recognize one God who alone is unbegotten, eternal, without beginning, true, immortal, wise, good, sovereign, judge of all, governor, administrator, unchangeable and unalterable, just and good. Lots of adjectives there. He is God of the law, the prophets, and the New Testament. He has begotten an only begotten Son before eternal times. That's an odd phrase. How can eternity have time? Before eternal times, through whom also he has made the ages and the universe. The Son was begotten, not in appearance. So that Arius is denying a Gnostic element here. Catch that. Son was begotten not in appearance, but in truth, and exists unchangeable and unalterable by his own will, a perfect creature of God. He is a created thing, but not as one of the other creatures begotten, but not as one of the other begotten beings. He's trying to say that this one was somehow unique, somehow different. He was created by the will of God before all times and ages, and has received both his life and being from the Father. The Father is the source of all things, but the Son, who was begotten by the Father apart from time and was created and founded before the ages, did not exist before he was begotten. This becomes the key point. Okay, Arius is saying that the Son had a definite beginning before which he did not exist. The Orthodox position, view number 1, said he is the essence of Yahweh, and Yahweh has always existed, therefore he has always existed as well. That becomes a crucial matter. He was begotten apart from time before all and alone was made to exist by the Father. For he is not eternal, nor co-eternal, nor co-unbegotten with the Father. Arius, very clear, but you got to look at this and you say, the Son is not an ordinary guy. He's something very special. He's not quite what view number 1 says. And this becomes the debate. So Brown and his sources blunder here when they insinuate that the Arian view was that Christ was a mortal man like any other man. Arius did not believe nor teach that Christ was just like any other man. Neither did the Gnostics. For Arius, while the Son was a created being, he is the first and highest of all God's creations, the being who created the rest of creation. Arius' bishop, Alexander, believed, like Arius, that the primary distinction between the Father and the Son was that the Father was unbegotten, but the Son begotten. Unlike Arius, though, Alexander believed the Son had always existed and was merely brought forth by the Father. And so this created some friction, and it led to this synod that Alexander called. The synod condemned Arius, but it didn't really stop anything because they had to have the Council of Nicea. Now, what happened here? There are no surviving minutes or records or acts of the council that were taken while it was happening. There are some primary sources, though, so that we know, not completely, but to a large degree what happened. There was the Creed with the list of those who signed it. That has survived. The Nicene Creed, you've probably all read it or recited it before, and the list of those who signed it. 20 canons or rules which the bishops passed. By the way, none of them have Constantine or the council deciding on which books get into the New Testament. That is a complete fabrication in the Da Vinci Code. Nicaea had nothing to do with that. Nowhere shows up in any of the canons. The synodal letter sent out to the churches telling them that the council was going to be held, that has survived. Later letters written by Eusebius and Athanasius, who were present at the time. Eusebius was a bishop of Caesarea and a voting member. Athanasius was basically just a secretary, but he turns out to be a pivotal figure in the whole proceeding. It is unknown exactly how many bishops attended the council. Sources differ in the numbers given. Eustathius of Antioch says about 270 attended. Eusebius says 250. Athanasius first says 300, and in a later piece of writing, 318. The number 318 is probably mythological because it's based on Genesis 14:14. So scholars kind of look at 318 and say, he's being poetic or allegorical here. Basically, somewhere between 250 and 300. That's how many were there. The council opened with a speech by Constantine in which he pleaded with the bishops to establish peace among themselves. The extent of Constantine's participation in the debates themselves is unknown. Eusebius tends to put more emphasis on Constantine's involvement than Constantine does in his own letters related to the council. And there's a source, if you want to go look up those letters, see what they say, you can check them out. It was very obvious that the overwhelming weight of opinion was against Arius and his views. The majority view was view number 1, noted before, that Jesus and God were the same essence, both eternal and uncreated, and were distinct persons. Now, Eusebius was sympathetic to Arius' view but couldn't support it. He didn't really want him kicked out of his position. So Eusebius and others proposed a creed, which was used in Eusebius' church later on. This was a scriptural creed, basically drawing its language from Bible verses, which agreed with the traditions and confessions of faith in all the churches. Everyone could have signed this creed. Everyone at the council, including Arius, could have signed this creed. We have this creed from Eusebius. Everyone could have done it, but it wouldn't have solved the problem. They would have just had to have another council. And so this creed did not work. It was adopted by the bishops at Nicea, or the creed that was finally adopted by the bishops of Nicea was a different one. So they say, nice idea, Eusebius. We appreciate the spirit in which you've recommended this creed, but it's just not going to solve the problem. We don't want to have to meet again, and so they voted it down. Now, the creed they produced, they put language in it to ensure that Arius would either have to change his position or would not be able to sign it, because that was the issue. The non-scriptural word was inserted as the centerpiece of the creed. It was the word homoousios, which means of the same substance. This word replaced homoiousios in the other creed, which meant of similar substance. Arius could have signed that one. He could not have signed homoousios, of the Father and the Son were of the same essence. Okay, so they changed that word. It's kind of interesting, if you look at the word, there's only one letter difference. One letter made all the difference in the world as far as the council was concerned. The creed, therefore, asserted that the Son was of the same essence as the Father. Athanasius wrote that the bishops wanted to express their faith in scriptural language, but the Arians kept twisting the words of Scripture so they would support their own views. So they abandoned trying to have every line of the creed come out of a verse, and they said, look, we're going to have to put extra biblical language in this thing to make sure it articulates what we're saying and so that Arius will either have to change his view or just not sign it. And so that's what they did. The Creed also defines the Son as begotten and not made. Now, remember when Teebing said, yes, the deity of Christ was decided upon by a vote, and a very close vote indeed. Yeah, 2 or 3 of the bishops that we know were there didn't sign it. Remember there were between 250 and 300 there? That is not a close vote. What, 248 to 2? It's just not a close vote. It's I don't know how else to say it, it's just disinformation at that level, in that part of it, that part of the book. Constantine in the New Testament. The Council of Nicea in and of itself had nothing to do with determining which books got in the New Testament. Again, none of the canons even mention this. The assertion that Constantine had a hand in the determination of what Gospels or New Testament books the church was to use is actually based, when I say it's based on this letter, trust me, if you read Bagent and Lee and these other people, they're going to link it to Constantine, for which there's no evidence. There is a letter in another context where Constantine writes to Eusebius, and in the letter, Constantine says that the large numbers of people in Constantinople, the capital, were becoming Christians, and he wanted the number of churches there to be multiplied. I want to start some other churches, he says. To meet the need of this expansion of churches in the city, Constantine asks Eusebius to prepare 50 copies of Scripture to be used, quote, for the instruction of the church. The only specific instructions Constantine gives Eusebius, and again we have the letter, for these copies is that they, quote, be written on prepared parchment in a legible manner and in a convenient portable form by professional transcribers thoroughly practiced in their art, unquote. The rest of the letter deals with issues of payment for the materials and the delivery of the copies. The emperor asks that the copies be delivered to himself for his personal inspection upon completion. He never says, these are the books that you need to put in, or these are the books that you need to take out. He never says it. And as we did in session, I believe it was number 2, we talked about early witnesses, early lists of the canonical books. The claim that Constantine fiddles with and fixes the canon is just false. There is no primary source evidence for that view. It just doesn't exist. Now, again, to summarize, that's all I want to cover about Constantine. This one was a little bit shorter. Constantine was involved at Nicea. We don't know the extent. It had nothing to do with fixing the books of the canon. The issue was about how to declare what the majority view had already formulated, had already adopted as the correct view of how to view Jesus' relation to the Father. They could see the passages that I gave you in the last session where you have a Godhead. They linked that to Jesus as the Son. The difficulty was, how do we express that? How do we talk about two persons, same Yahweh, but two Yahwehs, same essence, Father, Son language, and be monotheists? How do we get that down and express it in a formulaic way so that we don't have to keep fighting over this issue? And so they met with Nicea to specifically discuss with Arius. Arius never produced anything that convinced more than 2 or 3 people that he was right. He was outvoted at least 248 to 2. It was not a close vote. Any questions? Okay, seeing none, let's take a few minutes and we will come back for number 7.